Good afternoon, and welcome to Remote Production and the Evolution of Television Workflows, a TVNewsCheck virtual conference. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TVNewsCheck. We are very happy to be bringing you two panels today: television production in a changed world and virtualization, the cloud, and television workflows. We also have a fireside chat, news everywhere, produced from anywhere. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Avid, VizRT, and Delet, for making this event possible today. As ever, we welcome your questions during all of our sessions. This is Zoom, and you know it well. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the window. Use it at any time to send a question to our panelists, and we will do our best to answer it. Now it is my pleasure to introduce TVNewsCheck contributing editor Glenn Dixon, who will introduce his panelists for our first discussion, television production in a changed world. Glenn?
Good afternoon, I'm Glenn Dixon. The COVID-19 pandemic led to a dramatic shift in TV production as broadcasters figured out how to deliver news, sports, and entertainment amidst new remote workflows and a slew of social distancing requirements. As TV production and technology executives look ahead to a post-pandemic new normal, some of those changes appear to be only temporary blips, while others have already become permanent workflows. Today, we'll examine best practices in remote production and the pandemic's long-term impact on IP and cloud adoption with a panel of experts. Joining me are Brad Cheney, VP of Field Operations and Engineering for Fox Sports, Stephen Brown, EVP Programming and Development for Fox Television Stations, Joe LaMonica, VP Broadcast Engineering and Operations for Vice Media, and Brian Olson, Sales Director, US Group Stations for VizRT. For the audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible. So as Michael suggested, please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists, which we'll address towards the end of the session. Let's get started. Stephen, we've spoken a lot about news and sports dealing with COVID. I haven't spoken as much about syndicated entertainment fare. Can you talk about what changes did you make in the early days of COVID to try to get syndicated television production back up and running?
Sure. Good morning. So in February 2020, we kind of saw the writing on the wall. So I said to some of our productions that are daily productions, like Dish Nation and the new streaming service that we just launched, Fox Soul, to start banking evergreen material. Because I thought, you know what, we may have to go down for a week, maybe two. Let's start, shoring stuff up. And then on March 13th, when we left on that Friday, I really thought, okay, 2 weeks, we're done. We'll come back. Maybe a month, but that'd be it. And here we are 18 months later. So the very first thing that we did was we ran those evergreens for Dish Nation, and then we set up TVU services, recording and encoders and decoders back at our central hub. So we immediately put all of our hosts in their own homes, very much like I'm in my own home, and started shooting that way. Then Fox Soul, the same thing, but we used Zoom and the OBS solution, which was clunky and kind of, it was a little fragile, but we got it up, and we were producing 4 to 5 hours of live programming every day with that. 25 Words or Less, which is our game show with Meredith Vieira, we had just created this great news set. We're going back in April. We're gonna bring everybody in, and I kept thinking, okay, April, let's shift it to July, and then we're getting close to July. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to completely scramble. So we made basically a virtual set, and we had Meredith stay in her home in her basement, and she jokes about it all the time. She's locked in her basement. And she's got a backing with 25 words that look just like we did when we did the show, and her podium. And now she's in her pajama bottoms and a blazer and a top doing the show. And we have all the celebrities and the guests in pods. So robotic cameras, and everybody's in their pod where there's no contact at all. And it looks like kind of Brady Bunch playing a game. And what we found accidentally is that this was actually a better way to watch the game. Because when you're cutting live, the director has to choose which reaction to go to. And we have 7 characters on at the same time.
Right.
So now we can see all 7 characters and see their reactions to how their opponents are playing, how they're bidding, and how the game is actually played. So we stumbled into what we think is a better experience for the viewer. So that worked out on that. Divorce Court, we had already banked our episodes, but we had to get back into production, and we did all of our audience was virtual. So we used Skype and Skyped in our audience. So 40 people, and they could all listen and react in real time to the litigants presenting their case. And then You Bet Your Life was the last thing that we had to do. And that by that time we're already a year in, and we're thinking, okay, we've got this locked down. So but COVID came up again, and we had to have all those protocols. And the audience is in masks. We don't see them because they have to be separated by 4 feet. They're on masks. Everybody's in masks. Everybody's in visors, and except for Jay, who, instinctually wants to go and shake everybody's hands and, give them kind of a hug. So we scrambled, and we have a lot of, we learned a lot, and we use this new technology in some cases like Fox Soul to make better programming.
Thanks. You described a couple of things that sound like improvements that I could see continuing long term. What besides that 7 shot with all the all the participants in one shot, so you can see everyone's reaction. What other things do you see becoming permanent? And another thing is, when it comes to syndicated television, are there any cost savings to be had by producing in this way?
I wish. It's a double-edged sword. There are cost savings because you're not using cameramen, you're using robotic cameras. You're using shotgun mics instead of having somebody to, fix shotgun mics, instead of having somebody come in and, like an A2 and setting people up. The unfortunate thing is, because of COVID, the COVID costs for testing everybody are somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million a show. And we shoot all of our shows, 175 to 180 episodes, in 8 to 10 weeks span. So we're doing, in some cases, 8 episodes a day, 7 episodes a day. We're kind of pushing it out, and it's a truncated schedule. But those costs for COVID kind of outweigh or eliminate whatever savings we would have had.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. We'll go back to some of your particular challenges. I'd like to shift to news and ask Joe, what were some of the big workflow changes for Vice Media due to COVID, and what did you shift to that you see persisting, well beyond the end of the pandemic?
Yeah, I Thanks for having us here today. It's really interesting to talk about this stuff. It's crazy. We're still, living through it. I think to your point before, I had no idea this would be going on this long. I don't know how any of us, what we were thinking coming in, but certain things have really become, from a utility standpoint, into a daily driver. Our last day on air for our nightly news show was the 17th, that Tuesday. And everybody had a weird feeling that day, like, should we be here doing this? And we went home and got the email that we were going to go dark for at least a week. It ended up being 2. But then we came back on, we shipped a live view to our host's house. We had been using Unity Intercom as a utility, for field teams and so forth, but that became, in essence, our intercom frame in the cloud, and to this day, it's become, for editorial production, they like it more than being in front of a panel. It's been adopted so heavily that it is the new norm for our folks producing remotely. So in the early days, it was a live view backpack, sending prompter back onto an iPad from a Google Hangout, and making it work. It was we have dial-in IFB, and we did IFB for the host through Unity as well. So it obviously from day one was a little like we had to get our feet wet with it, but now it's such a good tool to have in our tool belt. Even though now more people are back in, we're mixing it up a little bit, but editorial watch down of the stand-up shoots still happens in the Google Hangout. A UTAP hanging off our router. We've got 10, what we call them, chat boxes that have all the flavors, your Zooms, your Hangout, your Skype, you name it, doesn't matter. We can feed anything into it and get anything we need out of it. So those machines aren't going away. We had 2 before, now we got about 10 of those. So I think on the digital and purely cloud front, we set up a vMix rig in Azure, in an Azure environment, which we were kind of doing a little proof of concept on before COVID, but man, did we hit the ground hard when COVID hit, because we could do all our remote, contribution for folks that don't have live views. We were doing, vMix, we can roll ISOs into vMix native into Azure and move that into our Lucid Link for posts. That's going to stick around. We use vMix, whether it's bare metal machines on-prem or in Azure, in an Azure environment, a lot, whether it's purely digital product or to contribute to the TV stuff. I think the big takeaways for me are Unity being super powerful. Wish it was more than 6 channels at a time, but I know we've got multiple instances and multiple pages on all of our Unity stuff. And for high quality monitoring, we worked a lot of SRT in over the past year too. So for our color guys and our mix people that need something more than a WebRTC Zoom call or something like that, SRTs come in really clutch for distributing out multi-viewers with 16 channels striped, and people have their decoders in their houses, the power users. So all across the board, I think this thing was just a major shock to the system, and we're coming out of it with skills that are going to benefit us going forward for real. So,
and how did latency present as a challenge with the cloud? I mean, when you talk to most people who are experimenting with it for production, that's the first thing they talk about. I know you talked about SRT for some of your monitoring, but overall, was that about what you expected? Better, worse?
Well, it's in the cloud environment. We found that it depends on who your talent is. In my experience, with latency, your seasoned TV news folks are going to ride that and not jump the guests and not do all that stuff. But we have a lot of we're not a traditional news outfit to say the least, and there was a lot of getting used to latency that I thought was a little on the heavy side, specifically with purely cloud, vMix running in the cloud, as opposed to our bare metal servers on-prem, which actually like did a better job because there's less of a round trip going on, I believe, related to that. Live view, we get down to a second, which, for what you're getting quality-wise in the HEVC is I'll take it any day. But for conversational, like what we're doing here almost, you want to dial that down as low as possible. So it's always a balancing act of trying to dial it down, but also get a good enough quality source out of it. Because I think Zoom has come a long way in the last year and a half too, for what it's worth. I think they're kind of kicking the Hangouts of the world's butts as far as that goes. But from a production tool point of view, vMix has the things that we value, the ability to roll ISOs, the very on the fly, build boxes and feed returns and decide how you want to build, whether it's just a contribution remote or do a whole show in it. I definitely hadn't looked at vMix as kind of a legit tool prior to pandemic. And now I'm like, man, this thing it's got a lot going on. You can do a lot with it. So always go back to that.
And besides the cloud instances you spoke about, you hadn't done a lot of work with remote desktop software before COVID either, correct?
Yeah. And now it's talk about, you name it, we have some implementation of it. Teradici for our cloud instances, Teradici, we were able to get, our peripheral devices to work better, whether it's an X keys or an audio controller. That's why we go with Teradici for that. But Parsec, also powerful tool for driving machines remotely. And then depending on who it is and what you need to do, I'm not gonna TeamViewer's always in the background, got it on certain things, but also everything has its point. We have VPN and AnyDesk too, so mixed bag. And I think that's another thing that I've learned from this, and I think I've become way less kind of, I don't know what I would call myself, picky or, elitist about what these tools need to be. It's like at that time, in that moment, it's like, what can we do to get access and make this happen? Because every day we were off air, we were feeling like one more day we're off air, maybe we're not going to come back. So it was a real push to throw everything at the wall and see what stuck. And a lot of it is stuck,
Yeah. Well, and I was listening to the Devoncroft conference the last couple of days, and there were a couple of people from the production community who were talking about, graphics artists, editors working from home, and basically saying that, people were a lot more accommodating. People who preferred to work at home, which was a fair number, particularly in the LA area, they were a lot more accommodating with technical hiccups than maybe they had been in 2019. The patience level was a little higher. Is that, you found that to be the case as well?
For sure. And I think everybody has a personality, but I think overall there was a little bit of, we're in this together. We understand that this is a tough time. Nowadays, I think there's an expectation that, we've got our stuff locked down, and we really kind of do. We know how to send the one sheet out. We know how to tell people to troubleshoot their connections and all that kind of jazz. Is like, in the early days, I know we went through iterations of how to communicate that best, and whether we build kits and send them out into the field, and how much more value are we getting out of that versus someone using their phone or computer. The value of a tech check prior to these things. Like anything, it's kind of basics, but I think being thrown into that environment in that way made it all the more important. And a year and a half later, almost 2 years, it's crazy to think that much time has gone by, but here we are, all on a Zoom.
Yeah. And I like to think we've all gotten better at it ourselves, but we'll let the audience be a big judge of that. Brad, I'd like to talk about sports with you. It seems like for major sports events, and you just wrapped up coverage of the World Series, that they're back to having a lot of personnel on site, compared to the early days of COVID, and certainly when sports started up in early summer of 2020. So what workflows that you took remote during COVID are you still doing remotely and plan to keep that way?
No, we obviously had a lot of challenges ahead of us as we started into the sports world with NASCAR being a pretty big sport, and obviously you looked at that spacing and the 6 feet between people and the airflows and all that stuff of those mobile units that you have to figure out. And so what it ended up being was that with a lot less other broadcasters with you at a major sporting event, it turned into a lot more trucks on the national broadcaster side to handle all of these people. And so as we did that, we also started to remote people out of these locations and into centralized facilities. And so we've got a number of them throughout the U.S. that we leverage on. Obviously, the main one at our LA Network Center in Los Angeles, which hosts up to 40 people on a given day in pods that connect out to different mobile units and become part of the show. And so we've got everything from graphics to replay to other ADs and support people in that facility, working on all those shows to a point of during the World Series and this last weekend, we actually had overflow to the point that we were, shift scheduling people into those slots and into those rooms. So, we've really gotten it to max capacity, and that just proves that it didn't go away when we've gone back. And, for us at Fox, that's been kind of a build of the mantra, is that we built something that was going to be sustainable for years to come and allow us to better enhance our productions by using consistent people on consistent shows and making that kind of workflow work. Because the challenge that's out there still right now is travel. And for teams like us that do travel and hire a lot of people in a very short period of time, well over 1,500 people work on a weekend. And when you get to a World Series weekend, you're talking about over 2,000 people that are just working in a 3-day span for us. And so to move them in and out and into these different places throughout the country, it's just not as easy as it used to be honest. The flights are all full. The cargo planes are all full. Everything's full out there. And so while that's a good thing, it's that gain of getting everybody back to capacity. And we saw it again last weekend with, some weather issues on flights that turned into some staffing issues for one of the major airlines. And each one of these airlines is going to see it. And, we had people stranded for a day or two in certain cities, not able to get to where they need to go because there's no overflow capacity. And so having this ability to have a facility in Los Angeles like we do, in Charlotte, North Carolina like we do, and in Chicago with the Big Ten Network, and the same thing of leveraging not only what we've termed the vault and our offsite productions for people supporting a main show being produced on site, but also obviously our HRP productions. We have multiple control rooms to each one of those network centers that allow us to do these shows. And so, to think back and look at what we've done, it's, everything from Major League Baseball to Major League Soccer to college football. College football, the majority of our shows are actually being produced in our Los Angeles and our Charlotte network centers. And to be honest, we've been able to do a little more with those shows because they're HRPs, and because we're not spending as much money on travel, we're actually, putting it back into product and able to do more with our stuff. And so, now that, like Steven said, now that we're not testing fully and doing all those things, those costs start to come back in line, and therefore, our show costs get back to where they were, and we're able to kind of leverage our budgets to make sure that we're satisfying a better product for not only the leagues that we do, but also obviously our ad sales teams who are selling the product that's out there. So while there's a lot of people out in the field, there's a whole lot of people in our network centers, producing this stuff and being able to do so, which is obviously extremely beneficial to us, and we feel the viewers.
Yeah, and for people not familiar, for HRP, that's a home run production, right?
That's correct. Yeah, home run production, Remy. Everybody's got a nice acronym for it. But it's one of those things that is really something that we are all slowly kind of migrating ourselves into, and we were doing about 100 events a year before the pandemic started, and with the goal of kind of a slow ramp out period for some of this stuff. And starting to test some sports. But, it's interesting, you come back from the pandemic, as we launched Major League Baseball, and Major League Baseball was scheduled to test a number of shows that year, and it became pretty much the majority of the shows came out of our LA Network Center. And so, we were able to take designs and concepts that we had built up and obviously ramp them forward a little larger than we had initially targeted them to be. But, in the end, there's some real great technology out there, and being, kind of at the head of it, allowed us to do some of these things. So, when we talk about having partners that were able to ship and deliver during this piece, Joe mentioned, High Vision and SRT, and that's obviously, a mainstay of our vault workflows and that stuff, and that, them being able to ship and continue to build product has been, extraordinary for us. And I know a number of other people who've leveraged the power of the public internet that exists, and in doing so, not to mention, a bunch of other pieces like Unity and Arvon and VoIP comms and things like that allow us to do these things alongside of what we do. And as well, I think that the vendors are sticking alongside of us and starting to integrate that stuff into their product to make it more flexible, which is extremely valuable to what we all do. Because, the more pieces you put in line, the more difficult it becomes to manage and make sure that it's working, because you're troubleshooting more. Whereas if it's in a product already, it's a very valuable piece. And, like we say, the Unity is very nice, as Joe pointed out, in that it's on your desktop. It's part of your computer. It's not another device sitting somewhere. It's all, if your computer's connected to the internet, Unity is going to work. And there's some benefit there to that. And as many others are starting to bring out about putting WebRTC and SRT protocols into their machines and things like that, it just makes everybody's life just a little bit easier, because, the one piece was that the engineers that are out there and have built this stuff with us, really are rock stars, and we need to not burn these people out, because there are not a lot of them in this industry available to do these kind of things. So,
yeah, well, I was listening to your colleague Mike Davies speak during Devoncroft yesterday, and he made a point about High Vision. He said they, wasn't somebody that you used maybe 3 years ago, and now you're one of their biggest customers, and multiple units. And he also did speak to the labor issue you mentioned, that because of the jumble in sports that happened in 2020 with losing some visiting team feeds and some of the shoulder programming, that there has been a reduction in the workforce, and and he made that point that with all this complex technology, you really do need specialized engineers and operators with sports experience more than ever. Just to follow up on the remote replay scenario you described, does that in some ways allow you to have more replay looks for an event? Because I know when writing about things like the Super Bowl, there was sort of a physical limit to how many EVS machines you could bring on site, just because of how much space they took up in the trucks. Are you now, do you have more channels of replay for maybe a second tier college football game on a Saturday than you would have 3 years ago?
We definitely have a little more, without a doubt, on those shows, and with that capability that's out there. And I think honestly, Glenn, as we look at it, it's actually, one of the biggest benefits of some of this change in workflow and some of what COVID brought along was putting people, especially in sports, in the right sized workspace. And in many cases, we would add equipment and machines and people and figure out how to take a 5 or a 6 wide area and make it 7 wide, or make a 4 wide area, 5 wide area. And so you had people crammed in and operating their machines in a very tight area and doing things that were pretty complex in probably not the most optimal work conditions. And now, in having to spread these people out and having to put people back in a different facility, they've gotten larger monitors to look at things, which means that they're not looking at very microscopic monitors trying to edit clips and replay and things like that. So I think the benefit's actually been in the operator's ability to do more for us, because they're in a better environment. And I think that's the same thing that's said for graphics operators and editors who are working from home. All of a sudden now you're working in better conditions, so to say, in a more comfortable environment. And if you're more comfortable and you're better rested, you're going to produce better for us. And and that's been really the bonus, is that. And then the other one that's alongside that is that a lot of the replay positions that we're off-siting in many cases are very specialized. And so a lot of times when you're adding into these things, a lot of these people are locals. And so they might be seeing this device for the first time, the second time ever. Whereas when we send it back to Los Angeles, they're operating the same thing every week, doing C360 replays or the pylons or some of those devices that are just extremely specialized, and we're able to leverage a local operator technically because they're local to Los Angeles, but they're with that show every week. They're with those pylons every week, and they're producing that way every week. So they're selling correctly to production, and that's obviously a benefit to the show.
And to the same point, you're doing a fair amount of remote commentary for sports as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know, you talk about the travel issues with COVID that have made some of these, new workflows necessary. Also, there's, kind of a work-life balance benefit to some of this stuff too, right?
No, obviously, as we all started out, there was a need to not put people places because you weren't allowed to put people places. And so, especially when you talk about announcers and wanting to be unmasked and wanting to be in these facilities where they weren't allowed in, when you talk about going back to Major League Baseball, initially, we were limited to 30 total people on site. So if you start looking at adding in camera people and some audio effects and some basics, all of a sudden, you're out of people pretty quickly before you've even thrown in 2 or 3 announcers and stage managers, things like that. So, for us, it's been, something that's been out there and something that's grown. And so, the first part of it was getting these guys on the air to call games and these women. And the next part was that it actually became very beneficial to people's lives. And so, we had one of our main analysts actually be able to go see his daughter graduate college, then go down to a hotel room, just off campus and call a baseball game at 7 p.m. that night. So, to be able to do that stuff because they wanted to call that game and be a part of our show and to have that flexibility because that's built in now and something that people understand and understand how to call a game in that methodology really allows it to happen. And that's what, some of these internet protocols like SRT have enabled us to do across the board. And so, it's that kind of benefit that's out there that not only allows us to put the right people on the right shows at the right time, but also give them a life that they normally would have never had. I mean, at some point, you get a choice, and we all know the choice you're making. You're going to your daughter's graduation, but to be able to be that person that says, I want to do both, and be able to actually offer them an ability to do both is extremely beneficial. And also to not have it look bad on air or sound bad on air. And I think that's the other piece of that that's really important is that we've gone past, when you look back at the Gulf War and then some of these early wars where, people are transmitting on the lowest bit rate possible on your cell phone, on those kind of things, that we've found a way to finally bridge that gap, that you can do something of extremely high quality if you want to, and still use the public internet to do so and be available in these places, whether it's in the US or in the UK, or across Europe, to be able to do that based upon cellular networks and the actual base internet.
Thanks. Yeah. Brian, I wanted to touch base with you on, looking across your customer base, and obviously, Fox is one of your big customers in sports. But what are some of the other remote workflows you've seen evolve? How have they evolved, I guess, from the early days of COVID to today? And and what are some of the key applications that you've seen customers just make a permanent shift to remote or distributed workflows?
Well, obviously, as you mentioned, sports is almost ideal for this type of remote and cloud-based workflows. And we've seen a lot of our sports customers start to adopt this. And there's the whole travel element too, with getting people to there and whatnot to the event. And it's also very suited with respect to cloud because it's seasonal for spinning up instances of live production in the cloud. You do it for 3 months, 4 months, whatever the season is, spin it down, and you're not on the air all the time, so you can spin it down when you're not on the air. So there's some definite cost savings there. Obviously, not traveling your people, and I know that Stephen was talking about not really having a lot of cost savings. I know that the COVID thing we hope will go away someday, and we'll have to test people, but I think the real cost savings ultimately are going to come when you get rid of the real estate, the physical plant. So you don't have to remote back into a facility for remote workflows, but you basically have everybody go straight to the cloud. And as far as the early days went, we saw a lot of that where, scrambling for whatever tools work we don't care as long as it works. And team viewer, remote desktop, Unity, I think is awesome, by the way, Joe. It's really whatever it took, but really all they were doing was virtually being in a facility. And so those costs were still pretty much there. Maybe they turned the heat down a little bit or something, but they still had those rent or real estate costs, maintenance costs. And I think ultimately when you can go to a virtual facility, that's probably where we're going to see the cost savings. But once we got over the initial shock of COVID, and people were using, hodgepodge workflows, they sort of settled into the fact that, hey, we're going to be doing this for a while. And hey, there's some, as the guys have said, there's some cool things about doing things this way. So what we're seeing right now is our customers are getting a lot more structured in the tools they use, the approach that they take when doing remote and cloud workflows, and bringing integrators into the mix and doing the design of their workflow. And we've got a lot of major news, sports customers, big giant social media companies that are doing productions 100% in the cloud with our tools. And we were kind of fortunate as a manufacturer, because when COVID hit, we were starting to do cloud testing, but from an R&D perspective, I wouldn't say it was top of the priority list or job one. But we did a pivot like I've never seen any other company I've worked for do, like on a dime. This wasn't like turning the Titanic. It's like we just flipped and said, everything's got to be cloud now. And fortunately, we had all of our tools are software based, all of our applications, and we have software video transport in-house too with NDI, and that is critical for cloud, because you've got to get up to the cloud, down from the cloud, and you've also got to be able to pass video between VMs in the cloud. And NDI, and I know Joe works with it with his workflows, lets you do that pretty easily. And one thing that we just released NDI 5, and one thing that's in NDI 5, which we're just putting the finishing touches on right now, is something called NDI Bridge. So when you're doing remote workflows and you need to get either back to the facility from your house, or you've got bandwidth restricted networks and you got to go between facilities, or the ultimate use case is you got to get to the cloud. NDI Bridge, what it does, you've got 3 quality settings depending on your bandwidth. Select the one that works the best, and even over public internet, get frame accurate video from place to place. Once it does get to wherever it's supposed to be, whether that's the cloud or a facility, it goes back down into normal NDI. So people on the networks, the local area networks, see their cloud and remote video sources, they look like local video sources. So you can see those in all your apps that are NDI capable. So that promises to be really interesting, and same for using NDI from your cell phone to get to the cloud or back to a facility. So we were fortunate in that we had that stuff sort of waiting in the wings when COVID hit. But it's certainly been interesting to see all the different use cases, because we see all our different customers around the world in different areas of the business. But there's definitely a move in tier 1, I think, to these types of workflows. They're always the folks that go first and try the crazy stuff and have the ability to do that. Tier 2 is investigating it, but I think like historically they wait till tier 1 gets everything, all the bugs worked out, and then they'll jump on board. But it's been a wild ride, but I am really waiting for this COVID to be over.
Yeah. Well, you're not alone in that, for sure. You talked about bringing production feeds right to the cloud, and kind of running that idea of a production control room in the cloud, sort of obviating the need for physical studios, control rooms. And there was certainly a lot of discussion about that this week at Devoncroft amongst vendors and broadcasters. Now, to be fair, a lot sort of the consensus there between even people who were pretty bullish on the cloud was that might be 5 to 7 years away for full live production in the cloud. From where you sit, what time frame would you put on it?
Well, we're doing it now.
Right.
So a lot of our customers are doing it now. I mean, the big stumbling block to cloud live production, honestly, was the switcher. You know, most of the main, traditional switcher companies had hardware-based, FPGA-based products. You know, they've managed to shrink them from, multiple refrigerator-sized racks down to, I think you get them down to about 5 RU now. But still, you have to have that physical box somewhere and connect to it to do switching. And they're not going to, Amazon and Microsoft and Google are not going to put those in their racks. So ultimately, you have to have a completely software-based switching schema, which we do. So that really isn't a big deal. Really, it's been the biggest stumbling block, I think, has been transport up, to and from the cloud. And, most of our customers have used SRT to date. We're hoping NDI Bridge is going to be a new way for them to do it, because you'll be able to keep your signals completely NDI the whole round trip. And NDI will, even when it goes on public internet, will carry its properties of video and audio and tally and metadata and all that stuff that makes NDI so much fun. So I expect to see more of that from the transport side using NDI for that. But yeah, definitely switching in the cloud has been a stumbling block in transport, but those things are getting solved right now. And we have a lot of customers doing, full-on talk shows, live sports, news, from the cloud. And you can have your entire production team completely distributed in those scenarios. You can be in different countries, and still participate, because you can distribute off parts of the workflow. You can still have your audio guy, you can still have your TD, you can still have, replay, tape playback, graphics, and, you can have it as few or as many people involved in the production as you want to. But again, they're at home, they're not traveling. And if you're setting up a virtual production that doesn't have a physical plant or even a mobile OB truck, I think there's got to be some cost savings ultimately wrapped around that.
Okay, thanks. I want to go back to Stephen, because, talking about syndicated production, you think of shows with a big hard set and an audience in the seats, and the reaction and the back and forth between the audience and the hosts and the participants. You mentioned Jay Leno's just natural affinity for interacting with people. So from your perspective, when you hear all this talk about moving because moving productions fully to the cloud, where you don't really have a physical control room there, maybe, or maybe you don't even have a physical studio because you're using virtual production techniques and maybe bringing somebody in like green screen, or do you think that's realistic for, and really from a creative point of view, how do you see that playing for the kind of content you produce?
It is like on 25 Words or Less, our announcer was at his home. Meredith was at her home. The contestants and the celebrities were in the studios. They're all watching each other. So I think that was fine. I think ultimately the one thing that we miss on game shows is the high fives and the hugs. That's what we all miss, right? And that is kind of that natural human interaction. I love the idea of workflows and being making it easier for us to produce and to edit, and that makes sense. And certainly for things like Fox Soul, where we're producing multiple shows every day, and they're people are all over the country. And we're actually moving to the NDI, the new tech NDI solution on that. So that makes sense. But I think for talk and game, you need that human interaction. That's what we crave. So I'm looking forward to going back to that, but using a lot of the things that we've learned and the tools that we've started to accumulate to our benefit.
Yeah, thanks. We got about 5 minutes left, so I do want to take a couple questions from the audience. We have a question from John Schilberg. What percentage of feeds, and this could be for anyone, Brad or Joe or Stephen, what percentage of feeds emanating from home studios were done over dedicated private fiber lines versus public internet versus bonded cell? And maybe I'll go to Brad on that first, talking about remote commentary that you're doing for live sports coverage. Are you doing anything special with the backhaul from talent locations?
No, I mean, we're not. I mean, obviously we're making sure that, people have solid cable modem connections, or, obviously we'd love if people have fiber to their home. But no, we're doing that. And in most cases, I think the big thing that we've done is that all of our routers that are in the field that are in these people's homes that touch our equipment and that we can run are all cellular based, in that we always have a backdoor in to make sure that if something happens, we know what's happening on those cases, and we have another way to get out if we need to. The nice part about audio is that you can do it pretty low latency, and in many cases, if you had to fix something, you have that ability to keep them on the air during a broadcast. But no, we've been, I would say the highest we go is to home, is business class cable modem kind of technology in most of these people's locations and homes, and it's been, it's extremely reliable in most all places.
Okay, thanks. And Joe, what's your experience at Vice? Did you upgrade anyone's home connectivity? And not just speaking about, and I guess the talent question first, and then also, talking about some of the other people in the production chain, editors and graphics. Did you have to upgrade anybody in those roles?
For sure, yeah. I mean, from a contribution talent point of view, we're big into bonded cellular live view house. We've done the DeGeros and the mobile viewpoints, but live view is our daily driver as far as that goes. So bonded cellular on the high end, we didn't pull fiber to anybody's house for sure. And but we did upgrade a lot of people's home internet where possible. So specifically on the post side of things, the folks that are trying to do proxy workflows from offline workflows from Lucid and so forth, getting them, paying for their internet and probably still are, if I had to guess. But it's a huge difference maker. But I think the great point about this is that you can get that in your home, like a consumer level. I mean, business class is great, but even just like the nice consumer internet, if you live in a major city specifically, you're going to be able to get adequate bandwidth to do the stuff that you need to be able to do to a point. We don't have anybody doing 4K HDR offline, like direct from their Time Warner internet at home. But, it's really gotten to the point where this stuff is, you can do it, and I don't know that we were sure that was possible going in. And now it's kind of been proven out by this, I think, that you can actually do it. And I would be remiss not to mention NDI in my first answer, and how much we leverage NDI both on-prem, in the cloud, back and forth. We got a bunch of new tech stuff, and it's been really flexible. We're looking forward to getting the bridge stuff going and seeing where that can fit into. So.
Thanks. Another audience question I'm going to throw to you, Joe, because it's engineering, IT focused. From Rodrigo Fernandez, what type of new measures are you considering after security incidents that affected Sinclair and Cox? Has that changed your security approach in centralizing some of your media assets? So you're just wondering, I know people talked loosely about, taking down a lot of security safeguards in the early days of COVID just to get stuff working. Because, for some of the smaller groups, VPNs were a big stumbling block, virus, et cetera. But now everyone's pretty far into it. Yeah, just those recent events, have you changed anything?
Oh, for sure. I think I did speak about, throwing everything at the wall, and who didn't like that was our network operations and InfoSec teams at Vice. Didn't love that at all. Weren't happy with my team at all. So we've worked together with them. We're on a, as far as like the TeamViewer is not available. A lot of these tools are not available company-wide. We've been whitelisted to get certain users on them. We've got a pretty strong, our network team is very aware of these attacks that are going down and doing their best. And we have, strong firewall and reporting. So yeah, I think in the early days, we were like, please just open up these ports. We need to be able to do this to get on the air, and then have dialed it down from there. But my team in general specifically has the most kind of holes poked in the firewall for us. So if we wanted to, we're vulnerability, I would guess. So hopefully they're not watching this.
Right. Yeah. No.
Or the people that would get in. But it's been dialed in significantly from the early days on a security basis. Okay, thanks. And I think I have time for one more question, and from the audience, I'll go to Brad with this from Glenn Stillwell. Has the industry hit the tipping point where, for purely economic reasons, everything except the highest level productions is considered a candidate for a full-on centralized production? And I think that's tough. The high watermark of the amount of shows you do in a certain day, and I'll bring forward on next Tuesday, we're going to have 8 college basketball games simultaneously happening, all starting within 15 minutes of each other in kind of a round robin format. And to have enough control rooms to produce that content in a centralized facility, and then you walk into the spring for us and you find out that you only have 3 Major League Baseball games on a Saturday. I don't know that the capital is there from our ownership team to pay for the amount of control rooms you need for the high watermark days versus the low watermark days. And while some places have a plethora of continuing programming, some of us kind of go up and down based upon the seasons that we're in, and we're a very fall heavy group here. So I think from our side, it would be tough to get to that point. And I think that there's a lot of benefit to being on site with a lot of these shows. And so while the model will continue to evolve as we go forward, I still think there's going to be a lot of shows at every level of production happening on site. And I know that we have that as we go forward through our seasons that way too. So I think the biggest shows are guaranteed to be on site for a while still. But, as we move 5 years into the cloud and have that ability to put all that stuff in a centralized spot, I think there's a lot of challenges and benefits that we'll reap from it.
Okay, thanks. I see our MC Michael Depp joining us. So I'd like to thank all my panelists for a great discussion, and hope the audience enjoyed it as well. And thanks for your questions.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks to all of you. Joe, I want to assure you that no hackers were watching this segment at all, so you're perfectly in the clear. Thanks, Brad, Stephen, Joe, Brian, Glenn. Next up, I'd like to welcome TVNewsCheck publisher and co-founder Kathy Haley for a fireside chat on news everywhere, produced from anywhere. And we still welcome your questions for that. So turning it over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Michael. And hello, everyone. We've been talking about television production in a changed world, a world in which content must be tailored quickly, easily, and efficiently for many different platforms, and a world in which producers are collaborating not all together in a studio, but from far-flung locations. This is a world in which my guest has been steeped for the past 5 years while developing a completely new approach to news production. It's an approach so different that the company he works for underwent a rebranding as a signal to customers and the industry that it was up to something big. The company is Gillette. The product introduced just last week is Pyramid, and my guest is Raul Caspin, Gillette's Director of News Product Strategy. Raul is a Gillette pioneer and has played an integral role in the company's transformation over the past 2 decades to IT-based, fully integrated newsrooms. It's really good to see you, Raul.
Good to see you, Kathy, and hello, everyone.
As Michael mentioned, I'm going to be interviewing Raul for only 15 minutes. So if you have questions for him, please put them in the Q&A feature so I can relay them to Raul. Raul, I want to get straight to remote production. How does technology need to facilitate remote production, and how does Pyramid specifically address it?
Okay, so there are two aspects to remote production. There is a remote live production that was discussed a bit earlier. And there is also remote production in general to put together stories, because it's a profound nature of the newsroom to be spread everywhere with freelancers, with people working from home, but also with reporters on the field. And to cover your stories, you need to be where the action is, and that's all the field. And obviously, the time in which we were bringing back physically the pictures to the newsroom has gone. So the time to delivery is super important. And you want multiple people to work on that same story to deliver faster. So say there is an event somewhere, which is taking place. You need someone from the field to shoot, and probably the video feed is going to be transported through backpack technologies, internet streams, public internet streams. And then at the same time, you need someone to be starting to edit the video, put together a nice story while all of this is happening. And the idea is really to deliver much faster. And with Pyramid, we really expect to multiply by 4 this time to delivery by having much deeper collaboration between different roles to put together that story. And at the end, we want to work from home. We want to work from the field. We want all the tools available from anywhere, all the content available from anywhere, and with a web user interface and no compromise on functionalities. So we want the experience of using newsroom tools to be the same whether I'm home or I'm sitting in the office, basically. And as far as remote live production is concerned, I mean, we have seen many of our customers doing this, with even presenters presenting from home because of the pandemics. In tier 1 newsrooms, there is really usually a need for physical studios, so it's not as big as having remote production, remote story production from everywhere. But this is a trend we are seeing, and we are ready for this.
When Gillette first announced Pyramid, it was almost a year ago, you talked about how it would enable storytelling 360. And Gillette called this a radical approach to storytelling that drastically changes even the definition of a story. How does storytelling 360 change the definition of a story and the way it's produced, Raul?
Yeah, I think this is really important to when we wanted to do Pyramid, we needed to think new, because there are really 2 realities. The first one is the pandemic reality with people working from anywhere and collaboratively. And the second aspect is we need to deliver to multiple platforms in a more efficient way. And this ability to go digital first, this ability to bring the digital team on board or to bring the radio team on board. So have a single notion of that story with all the different angles you need for that story. So storytelling 360 is about having everything you need about the story. It's about connecting people with the content, with the different deliverables and the different tasks wherever you are. So if you think about it, in the past, we had, the ingest being done somewhere, and then a news gathering, stored somewhere else, and then the production is done somewhere else, and extra, etc. But especially TV, radio, and digital versions were spread in multiple systems working with different teams. So now this needs to change. And you can see storytelling of the next generation story-centric, basically. And everything that you need is here. So the content, the different angles, your news gathering, your different projects, being Adobe project or being, our editing projects. And also all the work orders, this notion of resource management is also integrated in the story. And beyond this, I mean, the story can also be connected to business communication systems like Microsoft Teams, for instance. So you can really create that notion of virtual newsroom around the story, in which multiple type of people are going to collaborate together to accelerate drastically the delivery of the story and potentially the quality of the story as well.
I was watching your demo this morning, and it was interesting because you're in the story. People are in the story, but they can still access all these tools that you're talking about from within the story. They're not just in a platform, they're in the story. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now,
and I want to make a point. You know, when you're big on digital, you need to deliver your stories to multiple different places, and you know, the audience that consume Facebook or Twitter or all those different platforms is a bit different as well. So you need to accommodate that. You probably need longer versions of your stories to go on YouTube, shorter versions to go on other platforms, you know. And this means, and this has been really difficult for many organizations, because when you have, for example, the TV edit available, it's very hard to relate back to the source material. And storytelling allows you to do these kind of things. I mean, it's much faster to find your ways, basically.
interesting. There are several large broadcasters here in the US, including the ABC-owned stations, the NBCU-owned stations, ABC News, and now a 24-hour news network that are using Galaxy, which is a delete solution that for several years has been facilitating story-centric workflow or multimedia production. How is Pyramid different from Galaxy?
Well, the Dalet Pyramid is not a new Dalet Galaxy. It's very different. It was rethink from the ground up. So we wanted to bring something to the market which is really disruptive and which is in line with today's expectations. So first of all, Dalet Pyramid has a completely different backend. So it's fully cloud native. There is a cloud native infrastructure using, you know, Kubernetes and Dockers and Linux, you know, those kind of technologies. But essentially, it's fully web-based, and there are also mobile apps available on Android and iOS. So even if you use the video editing tools, for instance, it's amazing the user experience you can get with web-based clients now. It's very smooth, it's very efficient. And also Dalet Pyramid has much more emphasis on those digital tools. So for instance, you know, when you go digital, you need to put much more emphasis on whatever the narration is, and you need to allow your viewers to watch the video silent, and without any sound. And for this, you need a much better handling of graphics. So we enable collaboration between the journalist and the actual video editor who is going to put the digital package together by, you know, automating the conversion of these digital scripts into graphics. And I think that can really make the difference, because you can customize your digital content much more easily and much more efficiently, and you know, address all those different platforms at once. But there is also this new emphasis on collaboration tools with the ability to connect your business communication systems like Slack, like Teams, and such kind of things. Obviously, storytelling is an important part of this. There is also strong emphasis on planning, remote editing, remote contribution as well, with also connection to with file upload and connection to those different backpack providers. And it's not any different from Dalet Galaxy in the way that it also provides unified news operation. And that has been always a big unique selling proposition from Dalet, because with Dalet, you can really have a single system to produce for radio, for TV, and for digital. And this is a great way to minimize the number of systems and the number of integrations you have, and have a much more streamlined workflows across the board. So yes, and as you mentioned, there is a big new large network that switched also to Dalet Galaxy. And it's funny because they went live actually 3 weeks before the American elections, and that was effectively 500 users working from home. So there were no one at the newsroom. So Dalet Galaxy already have an infrastructure which is fully cloud enabled, and that also enable you to work from anywhere. So that's something we provided already in the past.
And that must have been a trial by fire for them for doing just switching right before the election. Our next panel, Raul, is about the cloud, virtualization, the cloud, television workflows. Pyramid is available on-prem, in the cloud, or as a hybrid solution. Talk about the cloud and what it brings to Pyramid.
Yeah, indeed, Dalet Pyramid was built on those modern technologies, that can be deployed in pretty much any cloud. Okay, it's really cloud and agnostic, even though we have a strong partnership with AWS. So we are working actively first with AWS, but the solution is designed to be fully cloud and agnostic. But it can also be hybrid. You can install fully on premises and then leverage on cloud technology, as I heard in the session before. To burst your workflows, to have this extra capacity to process some of the content that you can't necessarily have. You can't process on premise because you don't have the capacity, the CPU capacity. So I think this hybrid is really important because we can leverage on the elasticity of the cloud as well. But the cloud is essentially an opportunity for you to centralize and to consolidate systems. Especially in the US, there are many networks with multiple stations spread all over, and usually as many systems as there are sites. And having many sites is also more expensive to maintain, to operate. So with the cloud, it's really a good opportunity to minimize the number of systems and save on the infrastructure. If you install fully in the cloud, for example, at night, you've got lower needs, the infrastructure goes down, it's fairly easy. And the last aspect is really agility. Cloud provides you much more agility. Adding 100 users for specific events such as elections, or launch a new distribution channel, or launch a new TV channel, those kind of things should be way more easy using cloud technology than it was before.
Let me ask you one last question about SaaS. Pyramid is available in software as a service. This is a big change for broadcasters, Raul. Why SaaS and why now?
Well, actually, Pyramid is available as a subscription, but there are extra options. So you don't need to go full SaaS. It's up to you. You can host and operate, but we give you the opportunity, we give you the option that Dalet monitors or that Dalet operates and hosts for you. So there are all these level of options. And really, it's the opportunity for our customers to leverage on Dalet know-how, Dalet capability, and to mutualize that those operation services, and basically to decrease the operational costs, to deliver platforms faster, systems faster, and it's also why now. It's also because it's readily available now, because the cloud is ready for all of that, and because at the end of the day, we need to be more agile, deliver to more platform faster, more collaboratively, and all of that at a lower cost.
It's like the industry knows it's going to the cloud.
Yes.
They just need a path, right? And I think hybrid gives it to them. They can go at their own pace. So they've given us a couple of extra minutes, but I know we're 2 minutes away from the next session, Raul. So I want to thank you very much for being with me today. Raul Caspin, Director of News Product Strategy for Dalet. We're going to take a little break now. It's probably going to be shorter than 5 minutes, and then we'll be back for the session called Virtualization, the Cloud and Television Workflows. See you then. See you, Raul.
Thank you.
As Kathy said, we'll be back in just a few minutes from a short break with our next panel. Once more, I would like to please welcome TVNewsCheck contributing editor Glenn Dixon to introduce his panelists for our next session, Virtualization, the Cloud, and Television Workflows. Glenn?
Good afternoon. I'm Glenn Dixon. Broadcasters have been moving to both virtualization and cloud technology for several years as a way to standardize functionality across large station groups, achieve new efficiencies and flexibility in production and master control workflows, and perhaps save on real estate, power, and maintenance costs. The COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular its requirement for new remote production techniques, has only accelerated that shift. Today, we'll discuss the technological and financial implications of virtualization and cloud-based workflows with a panel of experts. Joining me are Brandon Carlton, Executive Director, Technology for ABC-owned stations, Craig Dwyer, VP Global Cloud and SaaS Practice for Abbott, Waleed Hamri, Senior Director, Media Systems for Sinclair Broadcast Group, and Matt Varney, VP Technology and Operations, KXTX Dallas. As Michael mentioned, for the audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible. So please do use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists, which we'll address towards the end of the session. And feel free to get them in early. We got a whole slew of questions right at closing bell last time that we couldn't get to. So I appreciate the input, though. I have plenty to ask these gentlemen. Anyway, let's get started. Start with Matt. I know the NBC Universal-owned stations were already moving towards virtualization and cloud-based production before COVID. Can you describe the long-term strategy for your group, what you've implemented so far, and what impact COVID has had on that process?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, man. I think our long-term strategy is we believe a lot of the potential value of cloud is in the more bursty applications of production, right? Where we've got opportunity across our multiple sites and our multiple business units. And in some of those cases, we have 24-hour operations. In some cases, it's very bursty. In our RSN applications, for example, they can go from having a need of one control room to 6, right? we believe there's a lot of opportunities. So we're really focusing all of our efforts around the content creation and the live production space, right? I think automation and playout is kind of where everybody sort of started. It's a little bit of an easier task, I would say, if any of it's easy. But really the live production space is where we're focusing all of our efforts and really developing our plans and testing and POCs and figuring out just how far we can pressure test the deployment of those technologies. As far as what COVID did for us, I think as everybody said, it was the great LRP accelerator. I think on the vendor side, more than anything, is we moved from the beginning of the pandemic where we wanted these types of technologies, we wanted these types of capabilities, but they were still a little bit out of reach. Whereas a lot of the work by necessity happened over the last 2 years to where these technologies are real, and now it's really about operationalizing them, building the proper business models and support models around them, more than just kind of academic discussions around is it possible.
And Matt, for people who aren't familiar with it, can you talk a little bit about what you did with that data center in Dallas, and and what that represents as a step in your overall technical journey here?
Sure. We always kind of had a long-term plan of, we knew we weren't going to immediately take control room at production technologies and jump right to public cloud, and it would all just happen and shake out gracefully, right? The first step was just bringing the industry along in terms of, kind of step one was more of a lift and shift into virtualization and being a little bit more IP centric on our transport format. So that's what we started out. We did a few years back, and the idea was to host several stations off a centralized data center, but really leaning into the virtualization of what used to be kind of proprietary hardware applications and tech stacks. And that was a very good first step. We probably hit about a 95% virtualization across our production environment. But it wasn't necessarily the end goal, right? The end goal was great. Now that we're comfortable with that and we've done a lift and shift, let's start to actually, dematerialize the data center and run it in public cloud to take those, heavy, VMs and turn them into services. And that's kind of the next step here is how do we take that entire environment that we've proven we can decouple from the user interface where the equipment sits, and then now start to move it into public cloud. So we're starting to embark on that journey over this next 3 years.
Okay, thanks. And and just for some perspective, what percentage? I know a lot of your personnel moved out of the stations in big markets like New York. Situation was different in other markets, and COVID certainly the impact is varied regionally. But what percentage of personnel overall would you say have returned to the stations across the NBC group?
It really varies by market. We kind of never really did a whole 100% of everybody go home in a particular percentage return. A lot of our production operations, we moved remote where we could, we moved remote where it made sense, and we brought people back just from an ease of working standpoint. But I would say across our production operations, we're probably about 70-80% of the way back. But of course, our sales and G&A and those functions are all still completely remote.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to turn to Brandon. Can you talk about what new production workflows did the ABC-owned stations quickly adopt in order to deal with COVID? And can you describe the longer-term shift to virtualized and cloud-based workflows across the group? Like NBC, this wasn't something you just started working on in March 2020.
No, thanks, Glenn. There's really two parts to that, right? And I think to understand that, you have to look at where we started from. And I think this is not unique to our group. I think most of us, we spent a lot of time protecting our production environments, right? I think a lot of us remember the Sony data breach a long time ago as the first real major one that made us realize we needed to contain and be very closed off to outside connections and outside remote workflows, right? There are ways in, but when COVID hit, it very rapidly became a need to stand up a great many people to remote in and to work in, right? So it's how do you do that effectively? And of course, there's capacity issues. For us, we stood up a ton of VM clusters and allowed people to remote in there and closed off what they could attach to help minimize that risk. That was a big one. And again, not unique. I think a lot of the station groups are doing this. And I think like most of us, we scrambled to buy every laptop we could find, as did everybody else on the planet. And that became a huge challenge to get that and to stand that up. but it was a mental shift in trying to keep a closed environment that was really within your own network to opening it up to people from home. And of course, like everybody, that came with a challenge of people's internet connections varied. There was all kinds of challenges that happened there. And when we looked at this, I think for all of us, nobody knew that we're going to sit here 18 months later and look back and have this conversation. I mean, this was hey, very rapidly, it's going to be a few weeks, maybe a few months. Now it's another month, they'll be back. And so we look at those workflows, and a lot of those have stayed in place largely because the end date to this keeps shifting right in front of us. One of the things we did do that was somewhat innovative was we set up one of our directors to direct from home. So we set up a full overdrive system at one of our directors' homes, and they're remoting in. And by full system, it's really a VPN and a lot of PCO IP to handle the monitor delays and everything else going on to get the feeds back and forth. But we have a newscast on one of our stations being directed by one of our directors who hasn't come to the station since COVID hit. And she's directing one of our newscasts, ongoing. And it's a real interesting shift because we never really thought to do that. And we didn't really even believe it was possible until we got into it and started dissecting it. But it's a real great example of those workflows that we have historically thought you absolutely need a director at the station. How can you do this? How can you have them do it? And it helped us to look through all the other work functions of what are the things that we thought couldn't happen and what's really possible. When you start to take away that we can't, and there's a real need, it's really interesting to see that. The second part of your question, the long-term shift to cloud-based, that's really a strategic discussion, I think, based on functions and based on what's available, right? There's a lot of cases where you could do it, but you have to look at, should we? And I think all of us, if we stepped back and said, we need to build a new facility from the ground up, it'd be very different. But as we're trying to maintain a product and keep workflows going and shift those to the cloud, it adds a completely new dynamic. One of the spaces where we're engaged in that right now is graphics. As we're shifting to a new graphics system, it's an opportunity to stand up cloud-based workflows based around that. We've experimented with our West Coast stations where we're all connected into one system. So we're all working that way and we're expanding it across. But it's when you start to look at those functions, okay, while we're on the air, what can we shift? Let's do this strategically. And I think that varies station group to station group, but that's our next focus as we're learning out of this. What can we do and what should we do? That's the next step for us.
It's interesting that example of Ross Overdrive and somebody fully directing a newscast from home. That was something that was mentioned by, a couple groups that we've done webinars with as something they had set up as a POC or as a backup, but they hadn't actually flipped the switch on it. Sounds like you've been doing it in a live way for a long time. Have you had any hiccups or did it go, smoother than you expected?
Yeah, well, like anything, nothing goes smooth in the beginning, but it's gone really well. And the way that we architected this is that the director at home is really remoting into everything. And the beauty of that is if there is a problem, as we mentioned, connections are a big part of this. When people lose their home internet, they're not as hardened. I mean, our stations, I'm sure everybody, you have dual connections, you have backups upon backups, but people at home don't. And if Comcast or whomever they get their cable from or their network connection from has an outage in their area, you can't be left with a director that can't direct. And so remoting everything as opposed to moving the gear to that location affords you the backup plan of somebody at the station could jump into the seat and take over and keep things moving along. It was a huge part of that backup and really enabled that to work and helped us as engineers look at it and go, that's a real risk. How do we mitigate it? And that's how we ended up solving that. And again, PCO IP was really important because when you're streaming multi-viewers back to somebody's house and there's a half a second or second delay and they're issuing commands and they're not seeing it happen in real time, that becomes very problematic. But PCO IP really solved that for us.
Okay, thanks. And, following up with the same question I asked of Matt, with key people like directors still working from home and directing newscasts on a daily basis, what percentage of your overall staff have returned to the studios? I know you have a lot of big market stations, but how does it look across your group?
Yeah, so this is going to sound a little rinse and repeat from Matt's answer. But I think for most of us, the G&A folks, sales, finance, those folks are largely still remote, and they're a large percentage of what we do, or at least a percentage of that. So they take some of that. But focusing on the production side, It really varies. I mean, there are functions that just need to be here. I think a lot of our tech teams, we realize there are people that are critical and need to be on site. There's people that can handle work remotely. A percentage is hard to lock down. We've brought some people back, but it really varies because we, like all the station groups, we have stations in different states, and we're really reliant on the local ordinances of who we should bring back and what we should do. Certain states have a higher percentage, certain less. If I had to put a number on it, somewhere between 30 and 70% on site, depending on the location. It really varies. We haven't in any large scale started bringing people back, but we're looking into that. And when we need to, people come back and they come in.
Okay, thank you. Waleed, Sinclair began a virtualization effort for its news production systems years ago. And the group's also been an early mover in using public cloud for some of its master control operations. Can you give us an update on where those initiatives currently stand? And also describe what impact COVID has had, if any, on Sinclair's long-term cloud strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gillen. So the first thing is, I think what Brendan was saying is perfectly spot on. It's basically with Sinclair, we had new networks that we spin up from the ground. That was not something that we had to transfer or basically transform or transit. So it was built from the ground directly on AWS, basically on public cloud. So having the flexibility of design a solution from scratch, that actually gave us the leverage of being able to build directly on the cloud. When it comes to moving something that you have with the habits of the operation side, architecture, etc., that comes with slightly more challenges. So basically, that's what happened with the emerging networks. And we also had, a lot of our even OTT platforms, they've been hosted in public cloud for a couple of years now. So I think the challenge that we have ahead of us is maybe we'll say like now moving existing workflows to the cloud. When I say moving, that's the biggest challenge. It's not only a lift and shift, but basically we need to kind of like reinvent the purpose of the business, almost like question every step, try to challenge the logic answer that we all heard, that's how we used to do it, and try actually to reinvent it in order to put it on either remote location or public cloud. I think it depends on the use cases. And that's actually the path that we're taking. And it starts from the emerging networks, which is, I would say, the easier workflow to put on the cloud. And it's moving to stations, basically hubs, remote productions. And I think the more challenging one will be at the end, will be actually the sports network.
Yeah, fair enough. There's been a lot of talk about the cloud and not as much, about virtualization, just running things as common on common off-the-shelf hardware, that it's not, you don't have a function tied to a specific box, it's an editor or it's a graphics unit. Can you talk about what that's meant, virtualization with the benefits that Sinclair has gotten across the group, particularly, you guys have been a little acquisitive in the last decade. You bought a couple stations and grown a little bit. And can you talk about what virtualization means for your overall tech platform?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question, Glenn. So it's not only, everyone think about basically virtualization always, or maybe it's my engineer background, just thinking about the video flow. But actually it's much more than that. Like you can have programmers working remotely. You can have actually traffic people. You can have actually a lot of the pieces that make the whole chain, basically all the way to the air chain, going remote. And actually that's what we've been looking at, is every single piece of the workflow. We try actually to either like bundle the function, have a centralized architecture, so a lot of people can jump in. Like for example, I think Matt was talking about it, just the master control. Just so people are not using their same laptop, we've been spinning up basically workstations directly on the cloud. So even the look and feel that people that used to be in master control, when they log in on their platform, it doesn't look like a normal laptop with your basically emails on the left, etc. So we've been focusing also to look at the feeling of the people and make sure that it's the same feeling, just actually it's a remote button. So it might sound like a detail, but actually it's make people comfortable using a remote system and not having the feeling of the button when they need to move to the next program, whatever they have to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's user interface you're basically talking about, which I know was something that all the software companies would spend a lot of time talking about. You know, a decade ago, everything was about user interface, and it's something that's you know, in some ways taken for granted a lot in the discussion. I know it isn't, but it's not something that's paid a lot of attention to when talking about moving to cloud or moving to you know, I guess the idea of remote desktop is that you're getting the same interface you had at your desk, and now you're working from your living room, but it looks the same. But when you brought in and out and other functions like match control, it's obviously critical. Craig, can you talk about some of the key trends you've seen among Avid's customers as they moved from traditional production to virtualized and cloud-based workflows, and maybe also, you know, how you've seen their response to COVID-19 evolve over the past, we've been saying 18 months, but I guess it's a little longer now. It's more like 20, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, so I think it's really very interesting. Sometimes we talk about sort of COVID-19 being the sort of digital change agent, and it really drove a lot of decision making, you know, imperatives really, where we had a lot of dialogue with clients who were sort of considering, planning, doing POCs. They immediately sort of jumped into, you know, really working out how to adopt this at scale. I think what's interesting, so we have a couple of different areas that we focused on. One is an on-demand platform, which is really just SaaS-based, allows people to spin up editorial with storage and file acceleration to upload. That's been interesting to sort of see people adopt, and really has been very valuable for some of our bigger clients to be able to just spin up these virtual post-production environments. I think what we're also seeing is that there was a lot of adoption of virtualization all up, right? So a lot of clients had on-premise facilities they just wanted to, you know, run from their own data center. So we gave a lot of support for folks doing that. And in fact, we granted a lot of clients extra licenses to be able to ensure that they could connect remotely. So that was a big success. I think what's interesting now is that we're sort of noticing a couple of things. Certainly in entertainment, actually a lot of editors have moved, you know, are working from home and quite like that. There was a recent survey in the UK where 70% of the sort of companies and their editors who were surveyed said they weren't going to come back full time. And actually the other problem or challenge is that a number of those teams have moved out of cities. So a lot of the kind of work from home has meant people have actually relocated. So they're not coming back.
Right.
Now, so that's interesting. And I think it's creating an interesting dynamic where in this sort of new hybrid world, people want to be able to perhaps meet and work on the production initially, especially if they're creating a new show, and really get the sort of story and get the sort of editorial shape put together. And that's a very collaborative process. It's hard to achieve that when everyone's working remotely. But then once they get into the sort of scale, you know, editorial process, people can do a lot of work now remotely. And it's more about just making sure that they're checking in with their producers collaboratively with things like over-the-shoulder viewing and sharing sort of daily. So that has been really fascinating, just seeing the dynamics evolve. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the kind of meta themes, if you like, that we've seen.
And how effective has have some of those collaboration tools like that over the shoulder view, letting two people look at the same edit? How effective has that been for your clients? Does it replicate?
It works surprisingly well. I mean, we are able to, even in the edit on demand SaaS solution, we're able to add Zoom or Teams, right? So there's pretty much what they're doing is kind of what we're doing here. And people are able to kind of review, be in, if you like, virtually in the edit session. I think one of the things that that still we need to work on is the kind of third monitor, kind of like the high res monitor. And there's still some challenges sort of really achieving that. But again, you know, if it's up until recently, it was almost binary. Like the editor needed to physically be in the edit suite to access all the monitoring and sort of have his kind of full experience. I think we're now seeing, you know, there's a lot of workflows that can be accomplished remotely, and maybe they'll just come in for a screening or a viewing or a review, and they can be super productive, you know, and work around their own schedules a lot more flexibly than they could in the past.
Okay, thanks. You know, a long time question. We talked a little bit about doing live production in the cloud, and that's, you know, been sort of held up as a holy grail by a lot of people in the industry, and you know, maybe something that's happening today for some people, or something that's 5 years away for other people. Latency has always been mentioned as a big challenge to that, and I wanted to, you know, kind of ask everybody what they've seen with that. Has that improved a lot in the last year? And I first like to run that by Matt, and I do apologize. We had an example of bad metadata here. We had Matt's title incorrect. He is VP of Media Technology for NBCU Local, overseeing for the whole group, not just their station there in Dallas. So Matt, yeah, where is latency at as you're doing these data center applications and then going to the cloud, and what are maybe some of the tricks to managing that for live applications?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this last time. You know, certainly the transport codecs are getting better. You've got, you know, start out with JPEG UL and then JPEG XS, but the real answer is, you know, I think Waleed and I were talking about this, is the real answer is about synchronizing the control plane, getting it all there at the same time, and then operating in that synchronized environment versus, you know, trying to manage the latency of your transport and return. I think the companies that are understanding that and embracing that and putting the entire environment on that same synchronized plane, you know, those are the ones that are starting to really stand out amongst the competition for sure.
And to your point, if all the operators, if everyone's delayed 3 seconds, let's say, as long as everyone's delayed that same 3 seconds, from a functionality standpoint, it doesn't make any difference.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Waleed, you know, I'd like you to weigh in on that, and also, are there any different considerations with latency between different types of programming? You know, is it more of an issue for live sports coverage than it would be for the kind of news that Matt's producing?
So there's always the story that basically you don't want to hear your neighbors screaming and seeing the touchdown, the goal, or the home run before you. So that's why I agree with Matt. I mean, as long as everything is synchronized, put it this way, I'd rather be 3 second delayed, but everyone is synchronized, rather than trying to save 2 seconds in one specific workflow and having the other two being delayed. So being actually on our side, like even for our sports, that's one of the reasons that everything has been built using the IP workflow, is to be able actually to run everyone with the same clock. So the same clock is used for the video PCR clock. The same clock is used actually for the editing, for the transmission, etc. Because I want to make sure that whenever it's leaving the building and going to our affiliates, basically everything is synchronized. Then obviously what's happened downstream, that's basically outside of what we can do. But at least everyone is using the same clock. And the other portion is, there is a latency. Like if you're putting all your transcoding, for example, or all your video pipe on the cloud, there is actually an extra latency that you need to get it there. But sometimes we're talking about few hundred milliseconds comparing to for streaming app, and we're all seeing it. We're talking about 10, 20 to even sometimes 30 seconds of latency. So it might get maybe it will be a problem in a few years, but now having 1 second delay when actually all our OTT app are even on the show, like if you can get 6 second latency on a streaming app, you're really, really good. A lot of the apps that you can see today, they're basically between 15, 20 to 30 seconds. So having, if I can lose 1 second to put everything on the cloud and basically be flexible and have everyone on the same clock, for me, that's personal opinion. I think it's a win-win for everyone.
And as we discussed on the prep call, one of the things that people tend to overlook is how much delay cable carriage often puts on like a broadcaster signal by the time they run it through their channel grooming and compression, that you might be dealing with a significant delay versus the over-the-air broadcast.
And probably going through several transcoding paths. You're not going through one. A lot of MVPDs, they need to bring it back to backhaul it to the master head end, go into the centralized one, et cetera, et cetera. So all this link keep adding up. But again, for me, like when we originate content, if we can have everyone synchronized, and that's actually our big focus, is having the same, we're really cautious about having everyone on the same clock and being synchronized. I think that's actually a great value.
Okay, thanks. Brandon, can you talk about, how much of an issue have you found latency to be for some of the virtualized workflows that the ABC group's doing? And where do you see that going forward?
Yeah, so we can get to that. It just is a funny side note, coupling onto what Waleed was saying about the streaming services and the delay. I have a streaming service that I won't call out at home that I watch television on. And as I have my laptop open and during Sunday football and fantasy, I see my fantasy stats update, and 30 seconds later, I see the play on my television. So it's quite entertaining, those delays that you can't control. And they are massive, and they do vary carrier by carrier. That's something that's well out of our control. But what is in our control is the delay on our production side, right? And much like Matt and Waleed mentioned, it's that zero timing and getting that as minimal as you can, but making sure that plane is consistent and constant. And I think when we talk about the cloud, we're all thinking off-prem cloud and somewhere out that we don't control. A lot of the ways that we're solving that internally is creating an internal cloud, right? If you look at everybody that operates, even switchers these days, they're on the end of a network connection. They're ostensibly computers. And whether or not your gear is 100 feet away in your own data center, it's in the production truck, or it's in the cloud, or it's halfway across the country somewhere else, they're really remote connections. And so a lot of the way we've solved that is internally, we're running those remotes back and running our own internalized cloud, if you will, and controlling it there to try to knock down some of that latency. I mentioned PCOIP on our remote director. We recognize the latency going back and forth to a control room at somebody's house. If it's a second and somebody stops talking, but they don't see it for a second, and then they push the button to take the next source, now you've got a second of dead air, which is very frustrating. We use KVM, and that was the PCOIP part of it. We use KVM technology because KVMs are almost instant. And so we use that across the network to drop that delay down to less than a frame, really. So they're almost real time there. So you don't have yet an additional second of delay, somebody remote trying to direct that. So I think there's a lot of ways that we're all looking at solving this, but I agree with Matt and Waleed that zero timing and dropping that latency as low as possible is absolutely critical.
Thanks. You mentioned that, when you look at a lot of these remote systems, you basically have your own cloud internally. Of course, the way that you might pay for that technology is different than the costs associated with doing things in the public cloud. Can you talk about, ABC's take on that and what you see as the benefits of private cloud versus public cloud for the kind of production that you guys do?
Yeah, and I mean, ABC's take, I understand representing the company, but there's a lot of different takes, I think.
For the stations.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as we look at it, and look, it becomes a lot of a CapEx, OpEx conversation that you have to go through that exercise. I mean, first and foremost to all of this, the user experience has to be transparent. If you're in somebody else, you're in Amazon, you're on-prem, wherever you are, that experience needs to be maintained. And then on the back end, you have to look at it, right? And a lot of it's a case by case of what's the OpEx, CapEx, what's the overall cost to this? Where does that make sense? And does that guide you in one direction or another, right? And one of the challenges is that vendors are at different states. When you look at an overall production system, you've got graphics, you've got what it takes in the back end, you have rundowns, you have audio systems, you have video systems, you have all these things in cameras and contribution. And there's various states that the different companies that we do business with are in and how they integrate with that. And it all drives in. So there's not one overall encompassing answer. There's a direction to look at it for sure and see what makes sense as we're moving ahead. Hey, is this the right space to be? And ultimately, we're all moving there, right? We can debate the speed if that's tomorrow or 10 years from now or a year from now. We're all headed in that direction, but you really have to break it down case by case and instance by instance and see what makes sense for the vendors that you utilize in your journey to get there.
And can you elaborate on some of the benefits of using some of the on-premise hardware you already have, and not just that, but the physical locations that you have to run your operations versus taking as much as you can to the public cloud, which a lot of people are talking about?
Sure. I mean, look, there's a couple of factors in here. Cost is obviously a big one. A lot of times you look through and realize, wow, there's a real financial benefit to doing it one way or the other. Again, maintaining the user experience and the functionality. The cloud offers a lot of scalability, right? If we were a movie production house that 3 months need 1,000 people in and petabytes and petabytes of storage, and then we need very little for 9 months, obviously you don't want to invest in that hardware. It makes a lot more sense to do that in a cloud-based environment where you have that flexibility. For us, a lot of what we do is within a range where it's not deviating greatly, smaller, larger. It's more of a fixed known quantity. So it makes it a lot easier to look at that. Yes, you give up the scalability, flexibility, but if you're not utilizing it, that almost comes with a cost at sometimes that, again, when you start to do that breakdown, you realize, wow, it doesn't really make sense. I think another big one, and I've been in this business a long time, as of a lot of people, is that engineers are paranoid people, right? We want to make sure that when an earthquake hits and we have no connectivity to the outside world, when a flood hits, when a hurricane comes through Texas, when there's a massive snowstorm and there's outages and you lose connections, how are you going to inform the public? How are you going to produce your product and get something on the air? And I think that for a lot of us, there's a sense of calm that comes with knowing that you can, even if you were broken off from the outside world, continue to create. Now, there's ways around that. Obviously, this is a much larger discussion on disaster recovery, but it's also a part that weighs into that of, hey, if the worst happens, and yeah, maybe that's a 1 in 20 year, 1 in 30 year event, how are we going to be able to perform and function? And a lot of that's important. I mean, it just is from a news standpoint for all of the station groups.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I know you talked about some of the DR capabilities you have at your LA station. Speaking to all the potential disasters that could befall somebody in that part of the world, earthquakes and other things. You talked about the vendors being at a different place. All your vendors are different stages of this shift to cloud. Matt, I wanted to get your take on that. We talked about the prep on the prep call about there's conversation about what you can do technically in the cloud, and then there's a conversation about what it might cost you. And how do you see the vendors, how good a job are the vendors doing in addressing the way they sell their technology for this new platform?
Yeah, for sure, Glenn. So I think the industry has got a pretty wide range of where it's at today, right? So you've got some vendors that approach this from hey, this just turned it into a subscription model, so it's a blank check, and that adds value for shareholders, and we're just going to charge the same thing, and you will basically pay for it every 3 years. There's others that approached it a little bit more intelligently from the perspective of how does it actually work from a business case for the end user? Are they trying to scale? Are they trying to avoid CapEx costs? What is their objective? And actually build the financial modeling around that, and understanding that it's not just all instant upside for the vendor and all downside for the end user. It's got to be win-win for both. And I think some are doing a really good job at that, and I think others are doing a pretty poor job at that. I do think that as the vendors that are more comfortable in the space are coming to maturity, I think that you'll see a pretty significant shift in kind of who some of the major players are, in our scene, right? I think the ones that are kind of holding on to those legacy CapEx models and just hoping that they can continue to burn down the R&D investments they've made on those legacy hardware investments. If they hope to keep pulling that out over the next few years, I think that their market shares will start to decline pretty dramatically.
Okay, thanks. Matt talked about maybe people companies' stock prices responding favorably to shifting these new OpEx models. Devin Croft this week, analyst Josh Steinauer, he singled out Abbott as somebody who had really benefited from this shift to subscription workflows in terms of its enterprise value and how the street sees that. I guess making the point that not all revenue is counted the same. But I'd like to let Craig weigh in on it. It's not all just upside moving to this, right? There's some challenges with shifting your sales model from traditional CapEx to OpEx. Can you talk about what the journey is like for you on the vendor side and some of the new responsibilities you have?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. So I think you're absolutely right. So Josh did call out some of the sort of the benefits we've seen from the stock performance with subscription. As you said, it's valued differently. But I think just going back to cover a couple of the points we've covered with the rest of the panel. I think we sort of look at it through sort of three different lenses. There's kind of the technical element of does it work? Then there's the operational impact it can have. And then finally, the sort of financial lens. And I think when you look at certain workflows, some of them are very suitable to these kind of bursty use cases, like post-production for a production company. Like they need to scale up because they've just got a 12-week post-production project, or that got a new series, or perhaps they're doing they're piloting a show and they don't know if the show's going to continue. So there's a number of use cases that fit really nicely with this sort of elastic model. The other thing that we're thinking about is actually, so that's what we sort of term on demand, but we're also thinking about always on as well. And that's where I think hybrid becomes more interesting, because the utilization of a lot of infrastructure and plant that our clients have, they really want to be able to augment, leveraging what they've got, maybe augmenting that with burst to cloud as appropriate on a journey, like as you said. So many of our clients have, they've got capital assets, they've got their own data centers, physical facilities, and it's going to take a while for them to sort of really map out the best way to move fully to cloud, if that's even what's makes sense. Again, I think what Brandon was saying about private cloud, we see a lot of clients on that path as well, right? Maybe you've got the cost, the operational cost becomes much more efficient because you're using cloud hosted environments and a very consistent architecture. And that means that it's much easier to sort of skill share between the different patterns and these different environments. So we see clients sort of gaining benefits there. And then maybe just one quick comment on the latency topic that you were addressing earlier. It's really interesting. So obviously, when we're using editorial systems, between the storage and the virtual machines, which is basically how we're achieving the kind of VDI experience, we need super low latency for the high performance editing workflows in sort of real time. But we only need it in the data center where we've got the storage and the VDI. Actually, we can support some pretty some larger latency from the VDI to the end user. And we've got users using, it's ideal at like 20 milliseconds, which starts to give you a kind of geographic footprint of where people can be. But we've also had people successfully, very happily using 60 milliseconds and above, from the editor back to the data center. And again, we've got some folks who decided, well, we'll just put our facilities in the center of the US so that everybody's kind of got the equivalent experience, right? And they're all collaborating and sharing. So, my view on the latency topic is that everybody's really still very much learning about like how to optimize some of the different decisions they need to make. But you can have a very high performance editorial experience today running from the cloud.
Thanks much, Craig. We have a couple questions from the audience, which I'd like to run by the panel before we run out of time. First one's from Chandra Brewbreaker. Since the industry is moving into more of a cloud SaaS ecosystem, how have you all leveraged broadcast engineers and IT engineers? It's a mindset change for all and also skill set. Has there been a problem integrating the two? And I guess first I'll run that by Waleed and then let the other broadcasters take a stab at it. But what about the HR side of this?
So Glenn, I mean, it's almost like the transition that we discussed from SDI to IT, for example. I mean, that was, for us at least, was a smooth transition. But keep in mind, one of the central piece around our move was also to keep the same user experience. So it was a process, including actually our engineers, our master control operators, etc., to make sure that basically the user experience for master control, touching a button inside the station or touching a soft panel with the mouse and keyboard remain the same. That's actually part of basically how our people adjust actually to the cloud infrastructure. And obviously, there is actually new skills for any company that want to go to the cloud that we need actually to have internally. I can challenge you, I mean, like 10 years ago, Kubernetes for me could be an ice cream flavor. I had no idea what it was.
Right.
So there's also new skills in terms of security, in terms of IT, and in terms of cloud architecture that basically we're working on having in-house and basically on develop those skills as well.
Yeah, well, I know your colleague Mike Krelix made the point that it's requires a different mindset. You know, a lot of what you're doing is software development, and there has to be a certain willingness to have failures that you can learn from, which, you know, broadcast engineers typically haven't been comfortable with any level of failure. You know, that dead air that Brandon mentioned. Brandon, from your perspective, how have you seen the traditional broadcast engineers in the group and the IT people working together on this overall journey?
Yeah, so look, the beauty of television that drew me to it is that it was ever evolving and ever changing, right? I mean, we were on tape machines and we were analog and then we were digital and then there were servers. And there was a challenge, I think, earlier on when there was a larger division between IT and typical broadcast engineering. But that's blended a lot over the years. I mean, there's always new skills to learn, as Waleed mentioned. And again, that's part of the beauty of the industry. It's not I'm pushing the same button for 40 years and doing the same thing and then I retire. It's kind of the beauty and the drive behind a lot of the technical staffs. But yeah, there are some different skill sets. I think people say, hey, you're a television engineer. It's like saying you're an artist. Well, are you a painter? Are you a sculptor? I mean, there's engineering covers and technology covers such a wide swath. But we're finding that our people, yes, there are some new skills and there's a lot of learning, but people are eager to learn that and they're engaged. And it's something that we're all cognizant of, and we make sure that we pass those skills along and help them learn it. Again, I think that blending and that mindset happened a long time ago between IT and typical broadcast engineering. And of course, there's some people that are going to fall off and there's some new people that are going to come on, but on a whole, it's not as big of a challenge as it used to be just because we crossed that many years ago.
Okay, thank you. Another audience question from John Schilberg. What tools or capabilities would you love to see added to your tool chest to improve your distributed live production? And I guess I'll throw that question to Matt first and let others weigh in too. Is there any one thing that you're missing you'd love to have?
Yeah, I mean, I'll actually kind of pivot that question back to the prior question. I think the one thing that we would love to have is just a greater knowledge of a fuller tech stack across that, right? So it really comes back to the upskilling conversation, right? You can have all the technology in the world, but if people aren't comfortable with using, implementing, supporting that, then you can't really harness the value of that, right? So I think as an industry, we have to maybe do a little better job of thinking through the fact that we are now competing with more than just our own industry, you know, broadcast media, for example, that we're competing across the entire gamut of all technology companies. So the way that we recruit people, the way that we build growth and development plans around them, the way that we're more intentional about ensuring that they have the skills we need and the upskilling them when we bring in new technologies. To me, that's actually one of our biggest gaps is just the fact that we've got to have more concrete plans and more care and feeding of the skills development around the people that can implement these things, right? Most of the time, the challenge to deploying cloud-based production isn't necessarily the technology, it's the It's the ability and the bandwidth and the comfort with supporting it once it's there and really operationalized.
Okay, thanks. You know, we only have a couple minutes, and we don't have any more audience questions at this point. And I did want to turn back to you, Matt. If you can just walk us through briefly, you have a new station in Albuquerque that is making a lot of use of the cloud, the master control now, and then long-term plans with news. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing there?
Sure. I mean, that kind of speaks to what are some of the business benefits of cloud, right? And we look at it and say, well, scalable capacity, but most importantly, business agility, right? So Albuquerque was the station group that we acquired. And we had a very short window in which to take over master control operations to replicate a very complex distribution network across 27 full powers and low powers across the state, as well as a pretty short window, be it 3 months to stand up local news production. In a normal environment, that would have been challenging. In a supply chain that is pressured like ours, that was impossible in a kind of a legacy CapEx heavy model, right? So the only way that we were going to get that done was to lean heavy into cloud, where we did full master control and play out in cloud, handing off to encoding and distribution, actually doing ATSC encoding in cloud and handing that off to our distribution network. Now we're in the process of building out cloud virtual control room and news production solutions for that station as well. And it really came to it wasn't a highly planned out strategic move. It was just, hey, we got to be able to move fast. We got to be able to answer the needs of this business within 3 or 4 months. And it was really the only way to do it.
Okay, thanks. Well, it looks like we've drawn to the end of our time. I'd like to thank the audience for questions. I'd really like to thank our panelists for all their insights. I think it's been a great discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, panelists. That was a great discussion. Glenn will be back with TVNewsCheck's next working lunch webinar discussing tech trends for 2022 on December 2nd, where he'll be making predictions for next year with executives from Disney, Warner Media, and Graham Media Group. And you're hearing about that first here right now. So also, please join us for our first in-person event on December 14th, where we will present News Tech Forum at the New York Hilton, a day-long conference featuring some fantastic speakers and topics. Attendees can also join us virtually for those who aren't yet traveling, and you can learn more about and register for both of those events at tvnewscheck.com. Once more, I'd like to thank Avid, VizRT, and Gillette for sponsoring today's event. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.